Welcome back. Now today, the organization I was talking to, about 10 years ago when it started, a member of parliament, actually a minister, said that it was a thing championed by gays, lesbians and divorcees. 10 years later, it's very telling to see how far they've come. Today I'm talking to Dr. Sam Thenya about Gender Violence and Recovery Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess we'll start with what is gender-based violence?
Basically, gender-based violence is where violence is meted upon another person on basis of gender. It can be from male to female or from female to male as well. I think the female to male is less recognized because generally the gender violence is skewed against women.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so basically it's where it's based on your gender, and there's no other reason why that is being done except to gain control of the other person. That's the main definition of gender-based violence. So
let's go into the types, because even as I was personally researching, the list just kept going on and on. What types do you see globally and most importantly in Kenya of gender-based violence? Sorry.
We can categorize them in a couple of ways. One is the physical abuse, where somebody is being physically insulted, that is beaten, they get some bodily harm. Again, I think that is more recognized because when there's an injury, people and the society are able to recognize that and be able to say, look, what happened to your eye, what happened to your face? Then you say, oh, you know, someone so-and-so struck me. And it's also difficult to hide. Unrecognized forms include psychological violence, of psychological abuse. And this is probably very severe as well, equal to the physical abuse, because this is where somebody tries to control the mind. And it can include manipulation, it can be emotional abuse, it can include even deprivation of certain rights. And in its severe form, it can actually even lead to suicide, so to speak. Then, of course, there is the verbal abuse, where somebody directly insults them, intimidates them, demeans them, especially humiliating them in public. This is again recognized not just as gender violence, but it's also a criminal act as well.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, when you look at that totality, then that gives you the three forms, broadly speaking, of gender-based violence.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important questions, and you know, we've had debates even here at Power Breakfast about it, is when do you leave? You know, when he strikes you the first time, you know, okay, maybe we were having an argument, but what is it the continuous, or do you walk out the first time he does it? And especially like with emotional abuse, when do you say that that's that and I'm going to leave? It's a very fine line.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult in that there's a whole cycle of abuse. You know, the first time it happens, then the perpetrator, whether it's male or female, they'll go through a cycle of feeling guilty after the abuse, the first time it happens. And most of the time, this abuse is not because they are feeling really guilty. They are worried more about the consequences. Either the partner would leave or may leave, or they are worried that they may be reported. And then after that, they get into a cycle where they become remorseful, and the survivor or the victim actually thinks that the perpetrator has changed. And then things may even normalize. In fact, they might even offer you a gift or something to try and appease. And then things just look like things have completely worked or they have reformed.
Absolutely.
But the cycle continues where they start, or they continue to fantasize how are they going to either revenge due to whatever they perceive they have been wronged on. And subsequently, they're going to set up a plan. So the cycle again of abuse continues. So it's very difficult to say when does one leave, because especially the first time, very few people do recognize it in the first place, except when it is physical. And of course, then therefore, very few people report. But as the cycle continues, depending on the magnitude, we do advise that people leave the abusive relationship or seek counseling or separate for a period of time, depending on the nature. Each case is handled on an each case basis. So it's difficult to say that when it happens the first time, leave. Otherwise, then we might have very few relationships standing. Because psychological control, financial control, even some verbal abuses, they're pretty common, I must admit, in our society.
Absolutely. Let's go back to the Gender Violence and Recovery Center. What is your role when it comes to gender-based violence in Kenya?
The Gender Violence Recovery Center was set up in the year 2001 in recognition of the fact that we realized that the magnitude of the problem was huge, more than it was reported before then. At that time, only FIDA and a few other organizations that were dealing with issues of mainly, again, domestic violence. Sexual violence was virtually unspoken of. And therefore, we thought that, and we as a medical fraternity, again, at that point had not quite addressed this issue. The issues of gender-based violence were treated alongside all the other medical conditions, but there had not been an overt way of addressing and coming up with a way of really managing these cases in a standard, what we call protocol.
Absolutely.
So we came up with the Gender Violence Recovery Center so that then, one, we can be able to offer this service in a very systematic and professional way. And what is unique above all is that then what would happen is that especially cases of sexual violence where people have been carjacked, abused, were pretty common 10 years ago. They would come to hospitals and they would not be able to access healthcare because even the government institutions used to ask for copay. And if you've been robbed of everything, at that point, you don't have any money, you don't even have an ID, you need to access healthcare immediately, irrespective, and then you can start talking about documentation of payments. So that could not happen even in a public institution. And we as Nairobi Women's Hospital decided, look, why don't we then give this service for free as an emergency treatment, and we shall not ask for payment, and then systematically also document.
Okay, let's talk about then that symbiosis between the Gender Violence and Recovery Center and Nairobi Women's. People always use it interchangeably. What is the relationship between the two of you?
Let me simplify it in this way. The Nairobi Women's Hospital exists purely to take care of and to care for the life cycle of a woman. If I may just get into that a little bit.
Absolutely.
When a child is born at birth, either become man or you become woman. If you become a man, then you shall not take part in procreation except in a very small bit. But when you become a woman, you get the privilege of bringing life and nurturing life and making sure that mankind continue to exist. This is a mandate that's God-given, and more often than not, the society forgets that it's our responsibility as a society to ensure that we take care of the women so that then we can be able to have mankind continue, otherwise we become extinct. We become extinct. If you had one man and 1,000 men, mankind would continue. But if you had one woman and 1,000 men, then we would probably die off. So in a nutshell, therefore, we look at the whole entire life cycle of a woman from birth to when they become the girl child, to adolescence, and then when they get to young adults, and when they mature to be able to bear children, and even subsequently as the nurturers and carers of our society. So the role of Nairobi Women's Hospital is to take care of that cycle. Now, we recognize then, therefore, subsequently that this cycle sometimes get disrupted. And there are many forms that can disrupt this cycle. One of the things that can disrupt and does disrupt this cycle is gender-based violence.
Okay.
So we drew a ring around the caring cycle of Nairobi Women's Hospital with the gender-based Gender Violence Recovery Center to protect that cycle.
Absolutely.
So therein is a very simple graphic relationship between Nairobi Women's Hospital and Gender Violence Recovery Center.
Absolutely.
We are one and separate organizations at the same time with very different mandates. One is taking care of the caring cycle. Gender Violence Recovery Center is taking care of the protecting cycle. So it acts as a protection. Of course, there are many other forms of violence that can disrupt the cycle, but again, we cannot do everything.
If we look at, I've heard very many stories of people who are like, especially in the rural areas, if he beats me, it means he loves me. What are some of the programs you're involved in that goes down to the grassroots? But more importantly, what has been the reception of something like that?
Traditional and cultural barriers have been quite a big problem. We've worked with the communities in trying to train them, or in actually training them. And you're right that some of the communities we've worked with, we find that there are some communities that had developed internal mechanisms of dealing with forms of gender violence. And it was very difficult and still continues to be challenging to convince them of other ways. Some of them have these small barazas that meet of old wazes and sometimes a few women to sort out even issues of sexual violence, of course, domestic violence, and without recognizing that they're also breaking the law. So we educate them and tell them, look, it's good mechanism for conflict resolution, of course, but until you bring the perpetrators to book, they'll continue most of the time. So we try to urge them that, look, let's use the law of the land to resolve these disputes. Instead of just looking, especially when it comes to sexual violence. The other challenge that comes with it is that, as you rightfully say, some people are socialized, some communities have been socialized that if he doesn't beat me, then he doesn't love me.
He doesn't love me.
Yeah. So that becomes, that becomes a little difficult in that then you have to now again educate even the survivor or the victim, even as you deal with the perpetrator.